Hi everyone, welcome to The Path to Reason. I'm your host, CG Plaza, and tonight I have a very special guest, Niki Aktipis.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, I had another tab and there was a delay. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. I'm really glad to have you here. I don't talk about science a lot, surprisingly, because I'm very much interested in it, um, and it's a foundation of critical thinking. So uh, it's very important. But you are a scientist and you are a science teacher.
Yes. Well, I pretend to be a science teacher. Whether my kids listen to me or not is completely different thing. Um, but yeah, I teach high schoolers here in the United States. I teach biology and zoology, so the study of animals, and then just regular. We call it biology, but we don't really do microbiology, so it's just more life science background than it is strictly biology. I don't know how else to explain it, but that's basically my curriculum is just like make sure they know something about a cell, and that's pretty much my year.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question I ask to all my guests. It's usually more relevant when they produce content, but I guess I can ask you too. So, if you remove all this teaching, all the science side, and all this internet thing, what's left? Who is Nikki, the human being?
Uh, that is an excellent question. Um, because I don't know if I know myself without being a scientist. It's kind of weird because I've been on um, academic uh, this academic journey since, oh goodness, 2008 is when I started my undergrad, and I'm still in school. I'm personally still in school now. I'm getting my second master's in education. Uh, so all around, I'm just a scientist through and through. I'm specifically a biologist, um, and even more specifically, I my undergrad is a focus was focused in animal behavior. I do a lot of conservation work. Uh, I've done a lot of conservation work all over the United States. So I used to run a conservation crew where I got to help young people learn how to run chainsaws and how to create fire breaks and how to protect endangered species. Um, so it's hard to separate myself from what I do on the daily compared to like who I am in my own personal time. Um, in my own personal time, I have my own like it's getting to be a zoo. So I'm I'm an amateur zookeeper. I have 4 rabbits, 2 guinea pigs, a leopard gecko, a fish tank, and like a jungle of plants. This is the only room in my house that does not have somebody else besides me living in it. Um, and I guess overall, I'm a giant nerd. So when I'm not at work and when I'm not like sleeping like the koala I am, I'm playing video games. That's how it's always been. That's how I communicate with other people. As a neurodivergent person, um, so I play a lot of Pokemon. I play a lot of Borderlands still, um, and what I like. That's just what I'm up to. Um, so I hope that's some good description of what I'm up to besides
Yes.
yelling at teenagers all day.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because um, teaching science in the US is quite an ordeal, I guess. You're in Kansas, right?
Yes, I'm in Kansas, and so it's I guess technically we're still in the Bible Belt, uh, and it's interesting, especially for not just science. It's not just science; it's life science, um, because people tend to be okay more with chemistry and physics than they are with how stuff evolved and what do you mean the earth isn't 6,000 years old? And what do you mean that I'm related to a chimpanzee? So it's a weird conundrum to be in, because my colleagues don't face the same shenanigans that I do, because they get to teach all the other stuff.
So how do you deal with this usually?
Well, it depends. So I'm pretty surprised. I haven't had this more often, but I have had a few students who have come to me because biology currently is the life science that kids in the state of Kansas as a high schooler have to take as their specific life science. That is changing, which I can talk a little bit about here in a moment. So when I do have the kids that come to me, either that they don't particularly like biology or they are actual creationists, it's hard not to, I'll be honest, it is hard not to argue with them, because that's how my brain operates, is like, well, what do you mean you don't believe in this? What do you mean that you think there was a God that did all of this? Which, fine, I'm not here to bash anybody's beliefs. That's not my job. But if I'm showing you the evidence, I'm saying, hey, look at this fossil and look at what we have today, and you're telling me, well, I still don't believe it. Well, then how do you believe anything else in any of your other classes? How do you believe your history class? So it's kind of hard. It's kind of, you have to win over the kid first before you can actually teach them. You have to build that relationship with them. Specifically, last year was my first year teaching. So I had a student in particular, because we were online. So it was even more kind of ridiculous, because they would mute themselves and then come off of mute, and you didn't really like, what were you going to do with them? You can't kick them out of class. Would get on and say, well, I'm not doing your work because I learned at church X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, that's fine, but you need this class to graduate. Eventually the student did do the work, but they would do it kind of not completely. And I think a lot of pushback with the student was because they were, you grow up religious, you don't want to lose what you have, right? So there was this pushback of, like, they would ask questions, they would try to trip me up, but it was more like I was saying, oh, well, it sounds like you're questioning your religious beliefs and you're not understanding that there's a different side to what you've been taught all of your life. So usually with the students, I can make some sort of breakthrough. I haven't had a parent yet who's come to me and been like, stop teaching my kid that. But we'll see. My career in education is still young. I will say also, though, I mentioned earlier, so in the state of Kansas, and I just got this news, so I'm still having an existential crisis about this. In the state of Kansas, legislature has said biology is no longer going to have to be the life science kids take in high school. So it doesn't mean that I'm not going to have a job per se. It just means it's going to make my life a little bit more difficult when teaching zoology, because if you don't have the background of your basic biology, how am I going to teach you about animals? How am I going to teach you, if I have a botany class, how am I going to teach you about botany without your background knowledge in basic biology about how life is life? And that's, legislature has decided that, because this is a very conservative state, regardless of what anybody says otherwise. So it tracks for legislature, but it's also going to make life more difficult and make the upcoming generation even less scientifically literate than what's already been happening.
yeah, this push to make the at least part of the US less educated over the years, that's very scary from the outside of the world.
Yeah, I'm actually interested to hear, because my dad is Greek and he lives in Greece. So we don't really, when I talk to him, we don't talk about this stuff because him and I are on the same page. So I'm actually interested to hear what your point of view is about our educational system. Because I can only do so much digging, but to actually hear it from another human being would probably is going to make me more sad, but that's okay.
I think the worst thing that about the way it works is that states can decide of the curriculum. It should be nationwide and it should be enforced and checked, at least in all public schools. Because, as you said, from a state to another, depending on how conservative they are, they will teach different things, and that's that, and the problem of homeschooling, which is big in the US. Yeah, I think that, to me, that are the two biggest problems that need to be solved first.
And I am 100%, I agree with that. This is definitely a conversation I've had before about with other people who are against standardizing public education across the United States. There's been various reasons, like, oh, well, some states don't have the resources, or states' rights. And I'm like, well, then we're all going to be on different pages. We're already all on different pages, um, which is unfortunate. And to kind of quote one of my other science teachers, one of the other biology teachers, we were talking about this. She's like, well, we wouldn't be in the mess we are in with COVID right now if everybody would have gotten the same information in their high school science classes in the first place, or even listened to it. And because people don't know about mRNA, and that's one of the basic things we teach in biology class is how mRNA works. And so if we're just making this harder and harder for ourselves in the United States, and it absolutely blows my mind on a daily basis. I'm like, I don't know how we function half the time.
Yeah, it's something that I think is quite dangerous, is the fact that politics and education are way too much intertwined, because the more the southeast Bible Belt, the more time passes, and the more their education is lowering, and the more conservative they get, and that impacts conservatism, which votes the law, and that's a self-entertaining cycle. And so it's extremely hard to break the cycle.
Yeah, it definitely is. I was just fortunate enough because I grew up with a teacher. Like, my mother was a teacher. She warned me not to be a teacher. Oops. So I grew up in an environment to where education was valued, and to where, like, reason was valued. My partner, I don't want to say on the other hand, but he grew up in a very conservative household. He went to public school. He's from Arkansas, but he got a completely different science education than I did. And I think that's sometimes why he keeps me around, is because he'll be like, well, we were talking about how plants work not too long ago. And I was like, well, here's how photosynthesis works. And he's like, wow, nobody has ever taught me that. And I'm like, what were you doing in science class? And he's like, I grew up in the South. Like, we touched on some of the stuff, but it wasn't anything of like what you're saying. I'm like, yikes.
Yeah.
So it's just state by state. It shouldn't be up to states. Science is science. It should all, every kid should get the same thing.
Yeah. So before we continue, I'd like to say hi to people in the chat. Hi, Samuel Hopper, Gustav Dore again. Hi, Cosmic Kyle, good to see you. Ascaron, as usual, super happy to have you. Brainbug is here as well, and he says, teach me zoology. So let's talk about this, and let's talk about animal behavior. First, let's see the big picture here. What are the main factors that impact uh, animal behavior?
So that is an excellent question. And I'm not quite sure if I can boil it down to main factors. I would have to say there is a basis for all all animals have, to me, have a base level of intrinsic behaviors. So when we talk about intrinsic behaviors, we're talking about what would be your natural behaviors. And I think it's difficult to separate humans from the rest of animals, because we like to think that our behaviors are far different than every other species. We think of ourselves special, which I'll touch on that in a moment.
True.
It's really not. Well, we aren't as special as we think, which is fine. Some people think we are. That's perfectly fine. But we share so much in common with other species that I think it's, and I know this wasn't your question, but it's very hubris to think that we don't share some of these intrinsic behaviors or traits with other species. And it's really detrimental to us in the long run. But when we're talking about behavior, so we're talking about intrinsic behaviors, and we can also talk about captive behaviors, because when animals become domesticated or they become tame, those behaviors kind of change a little bit. They become a little bit more docile, or they become more what we might say human-like. So yeah, I don't I don't know where to go from there per se.
Let's start with how reproduction needs or let's say behaviors impact the evolution.
Okay. Well, I can talk about reproductive behaviors here for a second. So, as you may or may not know, there are generally two types of reproductive behaviors, so asexual or sexual reproduction. As you may know, humans go through sexual reproduction. That means we really, really, really like to have genetic diversity. So we share gametes. Our gametes have 50% of our DNA. We find somebody else to match up with. And a lot of our behaviors, humans and a lot of other sexually reproducing species, our behaviors are based off of whether we want to have sex and reproduce, right? So humans, it could be, going out, getting all dressed up, and that's going to differ from culture to culture, right? What we find attractive. We might go dancing, and certain dance moves might be, determined. Oh, hey, like that's sexy. I like that, right? But those things are found in other species too. So I don't know if folks here are big into David Attenborough, but like that is my man. And he has so many documentaries about animals, right? But the one that sticks out most in my mind when we're talking about sexual reproduction is the birds of paradise. So there's not just one species of the bird of paradise. There are multiple. And some of you may or may not know, a lot of birds are sexually dimorphic. So sexually dimorphic means there's a difference between females and males of species. Usually a lot of times with birds, the females are a little bit more on the, I don't want to say drab side, but they're more plain looking. We might think they're plain looking, while the males are like really big and really fancy, have these big, beautiful long tail feathers, or they're brightly colored. And with birds of paradise, the males are not only super brightly colored to attract the females, saying, hey, look, I'm healthy. I've got all these bright, beautiful colors. I know how to find nutrients for myself. I know how to maintain these big, long tail feathers that if a predator came, they would weigh me down, but I'm big and strong because I can fly away with them. Birds of paradise do that. And they also really, really like to dance. And I wish I would have queued up a video clip of this, but they will dance to the heart's content, and the females will come up and say, oh, I like this guy's dance moves. Or there's like, son, you need to come back next year. Like, you have not taken enough salsa classes. And they'll fly away and they'll find another mate. And so these dances are really to tell the females, like, hey, look, I have strong genetics. I have all this extra energy after I've been foraging all day. I was able to get through the jungle or wherever I am to get my food sources. And I'm able to romance you a little bit. Like, look at this. But if the dance is not good and their feathers aren't looking healthy, the female is just going to say, look, man, I want my kids to survive, right? So you're telling me your genes aren't really compatible with mine. I have to move on to the next guy, right? So that happens a lot in birds. And birds are always the go-to because they're just pretty, right? We could talk about peacocks. Peacocks have those nice, beautiful, long tail feathers. And those are also for the same reason of saying, hey, I can fly around with these guys, not get caught by predators. I'm a good mate, like my genes are strong. And we can see this, we see this in humans as well, right? I'm going to come back to humans for a second. Like I said, different cultures call for different things. So in the United States, sometimes it might be, oh, well, hey, look at my big, beautiful car. I have lots of resources. I can support a family. Or, look at me. I went to the gym, but I can go to the gym and still go out to eat with you and then take care of the kids, right? They're saying, I am physically fit. I am resource rich. Let me have children with you. And that's how sexual reproduction works in a lot of animals. I'm trying to think of another good example. So some lizards are also like that. I'm digging in my brain. I'm thinking about birds right now because my zoology class is raising chickens. So I have like 20 baby chicks in my room waiting for me to come back on Monday. So birds are on my brain. But as far as asexually reproducing animals go, they're not all that worried about attracting a mate. So when I talk about asexually reproducing animals, I'm talking sponges, I'm talking some types of insects. There are certain lizards that do this. And asexual reproduction means you're basically just cloning yourself, which can be beneficial, right? Because you don't have to go and expend energy to find a mate. You can reproduce relatively quickly depending on who you are. Like sponges, they can just break off a piece of them on accident or on purpose, and it can float away and it creates more sponge, right? The downside of asexual reproduction is you are genetically the same, which is not necessarily always great, because if you end up encountering a virus or a bacteria that you're really susceptible to,
the entire population is touched.
It's just gone. Whereas with sexual reproduction, at least you have some genetic diversity there to where, different organisms within the same species might have some immunity. And that's how you can get herd immunity and all of that stuff, right? But also the downside of sexual reproduction is maybe you're like that bird. You're not doing a good enough dance and you won't find a mate. Also, finding a mate can be difficult, especially if, let's say, you're a solitary species. You might not find a mate. So you're kind of screwed if you want to reproduce and you can't find a mate, right? So depending on how you mate, how you reproduce is really going to determine some of your bigger behaviors.
Yeah, I've been watching the lectures proposed by Dr. Sapolsky, and they're amazing. There's a lot of knowledge contained in there, and the course is made to be understood by anyone at the beginning, and so that's great. And the way he presents behavior and sexuality, he says that every single behavior in animals is here to help them spread their genes, and that's how we presented it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Again, like I said, humans like to pretend that whatever we're up to is not that sex is not on our brains, reproduction is not on our brains, but it's intrinsic, it's an innate thing, right? And humans specifically, like with altruism. So I'm remembering back to college, and I remember the first time I heard that altruism isn't actually, it's a thing, but it's
Human.
humans in general and also other animals, because when you do an altruistic behavior, you're like, oh, I do feel good about this. But if others see this behavior and there's like, wow, that was a really good behavior, you really did a good thing to help somebody else out, that might be a potential mate. So just because you're doing it maybe unconsciously, saying, hey, I'm doing this thing because it's a good thing, and like I still get a little bit of joy out of it, but I think it was beneficial to this other person. Your brain is still saying, well, I'm doing this good thing because maybe somebody good looking is going to be looking at me doing this good thing, and they're going to want to get down to it later. And it's not just humans. Other animals do that, like they do this too. This has been seen in chimpanzees. This has been seen in bonobos, especially bonobos.
In many social species, I guess.
Yeah. And it all comes back to, well, somebody's going to see me doing this good thing, and in my social circle, and maybe they're going to say, oh, that's a good looking mate right there.
Yeah, I think we've seen it also in crows, because they're very, very smart birds, animals at large. So yeah, they're very interesting to study.
Yeah, and corvids especially. I was also having this conversation the other day because my partner wants to wrangle. He's just got into loving animals as almost as much as I do, and he really, really wants to befriend crows. So he's been asking me for advice, and I said, well, they're social creatures. Like, you have to show that you have to invest in the relationship. So you have to give them something they're going to like if you want gifts in return. And he tried throwing some of his hairpins at them, and he's like, oh, they'll take them, right? I'm like, honey, that's not how it works. You've got to talk to them. They need to know that you're paying attention to them, and that you are specifically offering them that gift. Because if they don't, they're just be like, oh, cool, nice shiny thing. I found this. Who did this come from? But yeah, there are plenty of studies of crows befriending humans, and they'll bring trinkets back, or they'll even look out for humans. So they might say, oh, well, this human was nice to me. I'm going to go tell my crow friends over here that they were nice to me, and we're going to keep an eyeball out for them, like when they're out and about. Or the opposite has happened, to where somebody is mean to a crow, they pass on that information to their crow friends, and that person gets dive bombed. And this can go on for generations. So it's not like you just piss off one crow and that's the end of it and they go get their friends. They pass this information on culturally. So their great great grand crow son could be coming after you, and you could have long forgotten about the interaction, but this crow generations later is like, oh, you insulted my family's honor, I'm coming. I've been told about what your face looks like.
And we do the same.
Yeah, humans are exactly like that, right? Like we hold generational grudges.
Yeah, yeah. In France, for example, there is this. I wouldn't say a grudge, but competition mind with the UK, because for 300-400 years they were the two biggest empires in the world. So there's this competition spirit between the two, and so yeah, it's exactly what you're saying.
And I also know quite a bit of the English side of that. I lived in England for a little bit, and I had a boyfriend there, and I was like, oh, I would love to go to France. Like, that'd be great. He's like, no, we don't like the French. I'm like, no. I like the French. This is a you problem and your family and all of England. Not me. I'm perfectly fine with everybody. So I am well aware of that rivalry.
Yeah. So yeah, I forgot the question I was going to ask. Yeah, we talked about sexual behavior, and there's a lot of diversity also in the animal world, because some species are monogamous, others aren't. Some will keep one mate for their entire life, others won't. Do you know if there is a pattern in here?
Well, that's an interesting question. So monogamy is very rare in the animal kingdom. So going back to birds, for the longest time, we thought a lot of bird species were monogamous. And it wasn't until we started to be able to genetically test their offspring that we found out birds are not like that. That theory just went out the window. It flew right on out the window, because we started testing offspring, genetically testing offspring, and we found that birds are for sure socially monogamous. So they will be seen with one partner very often, and they'll nest down with a partner. But then they're sneaking off behind their nest partners back and having kids with somebody else. And it kind of stunned scientists when they first started seeing this, because there's like, well, this makes no sense. We've not seen this bird with any other birds. Specifically, if I remember, I think robins. I think that's the case study I'm thinking about. Yes, with robins. And there's like, well, who have they been hanging out with? And they would have to go and genetically test all the birds in the their population that they had, or their sample size. And they saw that these birds that are socially monogamous, there's like, oh, well, the dad, because usually it's the mom, mom's hanging out with somebody else. The dad is a good nest builder and they're a good parent to offspring, but maybe their genetics is not quite great for having kids with, or maybe they're just not compatible with the females. So mom goes and she's running off and hiding, which is it's obviously very intentional, right? Because there's like, well, I don't want to piss off my nesting partner because they're not going to feed my kids anymore. And she would go off and mate with somebody else, come back, lay eggs, and the nesting partner's none the wiser. And this happens in mammal species too. There's evidence of specifically chimpanzees that do this, because chimpanzees have a hierarchy, so usually only a few get to mate specifically. But we've seen it in chimpanzees. Like there's like, oh yeah, this person is in charge. They're obviously very genetically fit to protect our group here, but I like so and so over there, and I think maybe they would be a good time, right? And so as we get to know more and more about animals in this way, specifically through genetics, so the behaviors that we're seeing don't necessarily match up with the genetics because they sneak away from us too. We don't see everything that the animals are doing. Just like with humans do this, right? And so it's interesting to see this happening. And I know there are certain species like the albatross, certain albatrosses do mate for life, certain penguin species mate for life, and it's definitely very hard on them when they lose a partner. A lot of them tend to die of what we call a broken heart, which, you know, they get stressed out to the point of like, well, it physically hurts. The emotional stress physically hurts and they pass away. And we often see that in companion animals as well, that if an older human passes away, usually their companion animal passes away relatively soon after them. So, and we see humans do this as well, right? That older couples, their partner of 50 years passes away, and within a week, even if the other one was in good health, they're gone as well. And you know, we as humans like to pride ourselves on, oh, we're so resilient, other animals do this, they die when they lose their mates, but we also do it, right? And maybe in social species, and I'm not advocating for monogamy or polyamory, but maybe with social species, that's what we need to be thinking about, right? Is, well, if we want this longevity and we're still doing these behaviors that are causing us to die early because our partners die, maybe we can figure something else out, right? Maybe that's not the social structure we should put ourselves in.
Yeah. I read an article recently that was proposing a hypothesis. They said that wolves might have domesticated themselves.
Yeah, well, that's actually for a lot of the domestic animals that we have. So the theory is, for the most part with wolves, is that they saw us with all this tasty food and they got a little bit closer and they ate it and would run away. And then generation after generation, they would come back and be like, oh, these people have food. And then they started living with us. And it was beneficial to them, right? Because they got a good source of food, a stable source of food, and we got the protection from them. So it wasn't at first like we went out and we were like, oh, that guy looks like, that wolf over there looks like they would be really, really good at protecting us. It was more of a mutualism thing of where the wolves were like, well, you're throwing this away. And I've got big old teeth. I could just hang around and scare off some of the other animals coming around here. And it was like a silent agreement. And then eventually we started bringing them into our houses, right? And we started purposely breeding them for certain traits. And with domestication comes specific traits. So one, the gene pool gets a little bit smaller. And two, when we're talking about genes specifically, so I'm trying to think of how to word this. So you have different copies of genes, right? And certain traits come together on certain chromosomes. And as we bred for certain specific traits, such as coat color or eye color in dogs, or aggression or stature, other traits started to come around too that were connected to, let's say, these beautiful coat colors. Also came being docile, trainable, a little bit, I don't want to say dumber, because dogs are beautiful souls, a little bit more compliant, I guess I would say. And these traits are all tied to each other. And we're pretty sure this is what happened in wolves, because there have been studies specifically. There was a study, an ongoing study. I'm not quite sure if it's still a thing. I think it might be, in Russia, with, I think it started in the 70s or 80s. I can't remember specifically, with foxes, with red foxes. And they wanted to breed these foxes to see if they could domesticate them. And so they started with breeding the ones that were more docile together. And along with that docileness came different coat colors and different social behaviors that we have seen in dogs. So with being tame came these beautiful different coats that you wouldn't see naturally happening in the wild. We start to see different behaviors, different play behaviors, barking to alert humans of stuff. And so
the face changed as well.
And the face got softer, more appealing to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're pretty sure that's what happened with wolves. They started taming themselves, and then we were just like, oh, we're gonna start artificially breeding you because you seem like you would be good to have around. And now we've got chihuahuas and pugs running around loose with breathing problems and what have you, right? But it's possible. We've done it with foxes. Cats also were kind of the same thing. And cats were domesticated later on, so they've still got some of their wild traits going on. But the one big trait that we recognize in cats as being domestic is they will not meow at other adult cats. They only meow at humans. And that's to say, hey, you must be a kitten, right? You're just a big dumb kitten on two legs. Let me help you out. Let me tell you things. And where it's like, oh, that's cute. So we keep those genetics around, right? And it's kind of cool, and you can kind of see this. My theory is okay, sorry. Back in business.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Just give me a second. I have I have audio issue. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
As long as you can hear me, that's I guess that's fine. So I can ask you a question and let you talk, and then do my thing in the meantime.
Yes, that works.
So we talked about how our reproduction needs and enforce and change our behavior. But in the case of, as you said, domestication, there are specific behaviors that we can observe due to the domestication. Do you have some examples?
Yeah, well, so I was going to give this example of, so we talked a little bit about dogs and a little bit about cats, but those are ones that we commonly know, right? So what I challenge everybody to do is to go next time you're in a big city or somewhere with pigeons and look at how pigeons act in a city compared to how they act out in their natural habitat. So go to a city and then go to a park and observe pigeons. So pigeons in big cities, they will tend to walk more. They will tend to be even more different colors. So you might see white ones with the little green speckles on them, or you might see darker ones, but their typical color should be this gray and kind of like metallic-y blue-green happening. And you'll see them in the parks. They'll be in trees more. They'll avoid humans more. They'll avoid other animals more. Well, if you see a pigeon in the city, they're going to be walking along the crosswalk. They're going to be walking down the street. They might not even fly out of your way when you walk towards them. And those are signs that they're domesticating themselves, right? Because they're getting used to being around humans. So it's this comfort level with humans. So it's not even just that, oh, well, they're tame and they've been around humans, so they understand that we give them food, but it's also that comfort level. They know how to interact with the environments that we've created, right? So cats and dogs are also a good example of this, because we can see dogs interact with our environments that humans have created, right? So we have beds for them. They know where the comfy spots are in the house. They know that an air vent, or they learn that air vents blow out hot or cold air depending on the season. Whereas, and if you brought in a fox, a wild fox, or a wild dog or coyote into your house, they would be like, what is all of this stuff? They would get freaked out by the vents. They probably wouldn't sleep in a bed because they're not domesticated and they're not used to that environment. And we can even see that with, if you go into wildlife rehab centers where you might have unreleasable animals, but they're hand tamed, and you go and put a dog bed out there for them, they're just gonna be like, what is this? Like, this is not where I sleep. They're not familiar with it. Even you could leave it in there for forever, and they're just gonna be like, yeah, I prefer the ground, or I prefer digging a hole and sleeping in there. Also with domestication, I'm going to come back to this, is this compliance. So cows in particular are really good with compliance, right? That's because we have to we've bred them because we are going to handle them a lot. We don't really want them to suspect what we're going to do to them if they're meat cows, cattle cows. And we want them to produce for us. We want them to not charge us when we come into the fields. So cows are a good example because they're not very clever. They're very sweet, but they're not very clever, domestic cows. But if you were to go, and some of the heritage breeds of cows and cattle, they've still got kind of that wild streak in them. So they're not as you can't handle them as much. You can't go up and hand feed them or milk them like you would a dairy cow, because we didn't breed them to keep those traits. Or to get those traits, I should say. And we like that in our domestication. I could say that about rabbits as well. So I worked in a lab for a long time. And like I said earlier, I have 4 rabbits. One of them came from the lab I used to work at. And he's not fond of humans for variety of reasons. He got poked and prodded, so got some PTSD issues. But he is still much more manageable. So if I need to check, say, his teeth, he's more compliant than, say, my little Dutch rabbit running around loose, who, yes, was bred as a pet, but she wasn't bred to be handled all the time. Riker, on the other hand, if I needed to give him shots here at home because he got sick or something, he was bred for compliance. Luna, Ruby, and Barnaby, they would be like, "Nah, man, you best have something really nice for me because I've got my own little brain cell rattling around, and Riker's the only one that you're going to be able to handle like that." Yeah.
Well, we haven't tried to domesticate them for a long time. That's another reason, I guess.
Yeah, and rabbits would have come after or around when cats did. And we mostly, for the most of human history, would have bred rabbits for meat, right? So you don't need them to be compliant when you're just breeding them for meat. You're probably breeding them to build up their muscles, and that's all you really want from them.
Yeah, you were speaking about cats not meowing to other cats, and it's funny because mine. So I have two cats, one male and one female, and the female, I think I heard her meow once since I've had her. And the rest of the time, if she wants my attention, she's going to scratch the couch, which she knows she can do, or she's going to misbehave to get my attention. But she never meows. It's very very weird.
So she's learned other forms of communication. So she understands that you've assigned value to your sofa, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna get a hold of mom's sofa to get her attention today because I know she enjoys this sofa a lot." So that's how I've decided. But humans do that too, right? Like, humans can be petty like that as well. And it just stuns me that we don't see ourselves a lot in other animals, because that is definitely a trait humans do.
Is there a human trait that we haven't observed in animals?
That is an excellent question. I would have to say the only trait is, and I'm going to put this with a caveat just because humans are the ones doing the studying, right? The only trait is language. And I say that with a caveat because other animals have communication, but I don't want to say for certain that they don't have language, because we've heard whale songs. We know they change them up, can make them novel. We know that birds can do that too. We know that dolphins and apes can also do that. So that would be the only one that I'm just like on the fence about. But the rest, we've observed all the rest of the traits in other animals because we all came from the same common ancestor.
What about greed and this idea that I'm going to get as much as food as I can, even though the others of my social group will die? Do we see that?
We do see that. It's not as common because they have their own rules, right? So chimpanzees especially is a good example where they might do some food hoarding, but if they're caught cheating the system, there's punishment dealt out, which we try to do with humans. But humans, again, have said, "Oh, well, we're above nature's laws, and we now have billionaires, right, who are hoarding resources, and there's no repercussions." So in the animal kingdom, yes, it does happen, but there's often bigger repercussions, especially if you're living in a social group. Humans tend to be the only ones who reward greed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never seen it that way. Rewarding greed. Um, yeah. Anything else you wanted to talk about?
Um, I don't know. I was just excited to be here and hear what questions you had for me. I think I will address one question. Like I'm looking at the chat, and somebody was saying something about if we learn photosynthesis and simple things like that here in the United States. We do, but it's so convoluted sometimes, and it depends on where you are in the United States if it gets through to your brain or not. And science teachers are tired. We can only do so much, and there's only, how do I put this? You can't argue with, it's difficult to argue with parents without fearing for your job. Because not all the, you can usually get through to a child, but getting through to the adult attached to the child is much more difficult. And sometimes you can teach the stuff, but that doesn't mean anybody's going to hear it.
Yes, I had a question pop into my mind earlier. Is there a lot of gene exchange between species during domestication?
You mean like within the species itself during
No,
domestication? Or
between different species. Like uh, I, I seem to understand that we have a part of our genome that comes from viruses we met during our time, and I was wondering if there was the same thing with animal we've been together for a very long time, like dogs, cows, cats. Do we know anything like that?
well, there is coevolution. So coevolution would be that not necessarily gene exchange, but if we see a trait in a different organism that we have traits that are beneficial, or certain organisms in our species are beneficial to that, like they work better with the other species, we'll keep that in our gene pool for longer. Um, also humans are known for breeding together other organisms that are closely related. So there's hybridization of certain species to where you can mix genetics, such as cows and the American bison. Believe it or not, and I would have to look up the percentage because I don't remember. Um, Bison, in particular, were like the staple in the American Southwest for a long time. We almost hunted them to extinction. We brought them back from the brink of extinction by breeding them with domestic cows or close to domestic cows. So there is that gene exchange there between we are doing between species to species. As for humans, you may know our gene our gene swapping happened when there were other species of humans around. Um, so if you ever get a DNA test, you may find out that some percent of you is Neanderthal. Um, Again, my this is a side tangent, but my partner's family, his dad just got DNA tested, and he found out that he was a large portion of Neanderthal, which I think is cool. Because my like my I don't have that much, but that shows that at some point we were swapping genetic information with other species of humans, and we were just the species of humans that survived and then continued on that genetic lineage, um, which I think is pretty cool because that's how species are formed, right? So sometimes there are mixing of those species, and then you end up with modern day humans or modern day horses or modern day cattle, what have you. And I think it's pretty cool to be carrying on an ancestor that may have looked nothing like me.
I had a chat with the Jehovah Witness about 10 years ago, and one of his arguments um, to prove that Adam and Eve existed was that we found through the study of genetics, we found population bottlenecks. And he claims that this is evidence that there is an actual Adam and an actual Eve.
That is,
Stupid? Yes.
yeah, I was trying to think of a good way to say that, because we see genetic bottlenecks happen in other species all the time, right? When populations decline and challenges come in the way. For example, with organisms, like with other species that are not human, I guess I should say, with the breaking up of the supercontinents, right? So maybe some of your relatives are all nice and spread out, and then all of a sudden you're cut off from them and you can't get to another population. You're going to start inbreeding, and then you have that genetic bottleneck. Well, we do this as humans now also through war or resource depletion, where we still have those genetic bottlenecks of where, like, if you're trapped in your own country because you can't get out because there's a war raging at the border, or you live on an island, like my dad, he lives on an island, you have to bring in outsiders to keep the genetics up. So that doesn't make sense that that's evidence for Adam and Eve, because all your genes would be the same. There wouldn't be a bottleneck. They would just be the same. So I guess if everybody's a clone of each other or had the same genes, I would say, okay, yes, but a bottleneck is not good evidence for that.
Yeah, Adam and Eve, or Noah's Ark, because they were four couples, and so they claim that this is possible because we've observed population bottlenecks. But and there's the thing that there is a mitochondrial Eve. You know what I'm referring to.
Yeah, all of our most mitochondrial DNA has said to come from one individual, which is kind of cool, but that doesn't mean that nobody existed, humans didn't exist before then, because mutations occur, right? And maybe this mutation arose in a population or one individual, and it just started to spread like wildfire, and now we all have that part of us. So that's probably how that happened. But also that's how lactose tolerance happened. Because humans, the default human stage is to not be able to digest lactose. Your natural state of humans was lactose intolerance. And it wasn't until a mutation arose in nomads that they were able to digest lactose, because if you're a nomad and your only source of food is the cattle you're taking with you, you're going to use the meat and the milk, right? And if you can't get the nutrients from the milk, you're probably going to die. So those that could digest it carried on that trait, and now we can drink milk. So it's the same with the mitochondrial Eve. Is somewhere that mutation arose, it stuck around because it might have been beneficial for something, and now it's just hanging out in all of us.
Yeah, another question popped, but it just went away. It was about this population bottleneck. Anyway, I don't remember. So, is there any other topic you wanted to touch on?
I think we've hit all of the stuff that is fit into my brain for the moment. I spent 8 hours trying to teach this kind of stuff to kids today, so my brain is like
Full, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's on empty. Like the petrol it's gone. But I was so excited to come talk to you today and talk to folks that are watching. So yeah, my brain is empty. But if there's anything else, I'm happy to answer.
If there's any question in the chat, if you guys have something you would like to ask, now is the time.
And
Uh,
and I'm familiar with magpies doing the same. They are definitely related to ravens. So somebody said magpies, in particular, the Australian ones, do the same things that crows do. They're related.
okay, so yeah, we touched on a lot of things, from the education to behavior and animal behavior. Yeah, I hope you like that discussion. Hope I asked interesting questions. I hope people in the chat liked this talk too. I'm sorry for the audio problem. It's just my usual earpiece didn't charge well. Apparently, I don't understand why. But yeah, thanks everyone in the chat. Thanks, Niki. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. I hope we can do that again sometime. So if you like the show, please like, subscribe, share, the usual thing. Thanks, Escalon. Yeah, don't hesitate to share. I don't have any Patreon or anything like that because I don't want to monetize this channel. However, if you want to help my channel, you will have a link in the description to my Amazon wishlist that contain books mostly. So that's what you can do if you want to help. In the meantime, I wish you all a very, very good weekend. Hopefully, some good news will will come out from the world. And in the meantime, I wish you all good night.